Imagine it's the winter of 1974. You're sitting in your Chevy Vega, creating a cloud of leaded exhaust that would make a modern EPA agent have a stroke. You've been waiting in line for gasoline for 3 hours. The line wraps around the block. You're cold, you're annoyed, and the radio is telling you that inflation just hit 12%. You look at your paycheck. The number is bigger than last year, sure, but when you go to the grocery store, that bigger number buys you less, a lot less. The price of meat has doubled. Sugar is up 300%. The government is telling you to wear a sweater to save energy, and the president is on TV sweating like a sinner in church, telling you that the economy is just transitioning. Does any of this sound familiar? Does it feel like a bad déjà vu? Welcome to the economic meat grinder known as stagflation. It is the absolute worst-case scenario for an economy. A toxic cocktail of stagnating growth and skyrocketing prices. It's the boogeyman that central bankers check for under their beds at night. For 40 years, we thought we killed it. We thought the 1970s were just a bad fever dream of polyester suits and disco. But looking at the charts today, the 70s aren't just history, they're a warning. And if you look closely at the data, the warning lights aren't just blinking, they're burning out. Buckle up. We're going back to the decade that broke the American dream to understand exactly how screwed we might be today. 1. The supply shock when the taps run dry. Let's start with the catalyst, the match that lit the fuse. To understand why your grocery bill looks like a mortgage payment today, we have to look at the Yom Kippur War of October 1973. Here is the setup. You have a world addicted to cheap energy. The entire post-Western economic boom, the suburbs, the factories, the massive V8 engines, was built on the premise that oil would essentially be free forever. A barrel of oil cost about $3 a rules. It was cheaper than water. Then, geopolitics kicked in the door. In retaliation for the US supporting Israel during the war, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, decided to turn off the tap. They announced an embargo against the United States and other Israeli allies. Overnight, the global supply chain didn't just hiccup, it had a heart seizure. The price of oil didn't just go up, it quadrupled. It went from $3 to nearly $12 a barrel in months. Now $12 sounds hilarious to us today, but imagine if the gas at your local pump went from $3.50 to $14 by next Tuesday. This is what economists call an exogenous supply shock. Here is why this is the first horseman of the stagflation apocalypse. Oil is in everything. It's not just in your gas tank. It's in the fertilizer that grows your food, the plastic that wraps your food, the diesel that trucks your food, and the electricity that keeps the fridge cold. When the price of energy spikes, the cost of existence spikes. In the 70s, this supply shock forced businesses into a brutal corner. Their costs skyrocketed, so they had two choices. 1. Eat the cost and go bankrupt. 2. Raise prices on consumers. They raised prices. But here is the stag part of stagflation. Because energy was so expensive, businesses also had to cut back on production. They couldn't afford to run the factories at full capacity. So you got higher prices, inflation, combined with lower output and layoffs, stagnation. Now shift your eyes to the modern day. But wait, you say, we aren't in an oil embargo, aren't we? Look at the global supply chain crisis following the pandemic, and then add the Russia-Ukraine war on top of it. Russia was a massive energy exporter to Europe. When those pipes were shut off, natural gas prices in Europe rose by 700% at their peak. We traded the 1973 OPEC embargo for a 2020's everything shortage. We broke the global supply chain. Semiconductors, lumber, neon gas, fertilizer. The supply shocks of the 2020s are actually more complex than the 1970s. In the 70s, it was mostly just oil. Today, it's a polycrisis of fragmented trade routes. The result is the same. The cost of doing business goes up, supply goes down, and you, the consumer, get handed the bill. And just like in 1973, politicians will blame greedy corporations or speculators, ignoring the fundamental reality that when you restrict the supply of the stuff that makes the world go round, the world slows down and gets a lot more expensive. 2. The wage price spiral, the dog chasing its tail. If the supply shock was the match, the wage price spiral was the gasoline. This is where things get psychological. Economics isn't just math, it's crowd psychology with money. In the 1970s, the American workforce was heavily unionized. About 25 to 30% of the workforce was in a union compared to about 10% today. Here is the scenario. You're a steel worker in Pittsburgh in 1974. You see gas prices double. You see bread prices up 15%. You walk into your boss's office, or rather your union rep walks in and says, "Hey, the cost of living went up 10%, so we need a 15% raise just to stay alive." The company, desperate to avoid a strike, agrees. They give you the raise. Now you have more money in your pocket. You feel a bit better. You go out and spend that money, but wait. The company that just paid you more, they have to pay for that raise somehow. They can't print money, so they raise the price of the steel. The car manufacturer buying the steel sees the price go up, so they raise the price of the car. The car dealer raises the price on the lot. Now you, the steel worker, go to buy a new car. You realise, damn, cars are 15% more expensive. Your raise just evaporated. So next year you go back to your boss and say, "I need another raise." This is the wage price spiral. It is a feedback loop from hell. Text, wages. Uparo, right arrow, text. Costs, uparo, right arrow, text. Prices, uparo, right arrow, text. Demand for wages, uparo in. The 1970s, this became entrenched. People expected inflation. This is a crucial concept. Inflation expectations. Once the public believes inflation is here to stay, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You buy things now because you know they will be more expensive later. This surge in demand drives prices up even faster. In 1974 alone, there were over 6,000 strikes in the United States. It was chaos. In the UK, it was even worse. They called the winter of 1978-79 the winter of discontent. Garbage piled up in Leicester Square because the dustmen were on strike. Gravediggers went on strike in Liverpool, leaving bodies unburied. That is not a joke. That is what happens when the money breaks. Now, look at today. We are seeing the early stages of this. We have the Great Resignation. We have quiet quitting. We have massive strikes in the auto industry, UAW, Hollywood writers, and healthcare workers. Why? Because the cost of living has exploded. While we don't have the same union density as the 70s, we have a labour shortage. Due to demographics, boomers retiring, and shifts in values, companies cannot find enough workers. To attract talent, they have to raise wages. Walmart, McDonald's, Amazon, they're all bumping starting pay. That sounds great, right? Who doesn't want a raise? But unless that raise is accompanied by productivity growth, meaning the worker is actually producing more stuff, it is just inflationary fuel. If you pay someone 20% more to do the exact same job, the cost of the product must rise. We are flirting with this spiral right now. Service inflation is sticky. Once a restaurant raises menu prices to pay the staff 20 hours, those prices never come back down. The baseline has shifted. The 1970s taught us that once this psychological dam breaks, putting it back together requires absolute economic brutality. Hey, quick pause before we get to the really depressing stuff, like how the government accidentally made everything worse. If you're enjoying this dive into economic history and want to know how to protect your money from the inflation monster, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell. Also, I'm curious, what's the one item in your life that has gone up in price so much you've just stopped buying it? For me, it's decent olive oil. I'm pretty sure it's trading at the same price as printer ink now. Let me know in the comments below. 3. The Arthur Burns mistake. Printing until the wheels fall off. Now we have to talk about the villain of our story, or at least the man who fell asleep at the wheel. Enter Arthur Burns. He was the chairman of the Federal Reserve from 1970 to 1978. If you look at a picture of him, he looks like a kindly grandfather who smokes a pipe. But his policies were pure poison for the dollar. To understand the mistake, you have to understand the mandate. The Fed has a dual mandate. Keep prices stable, fight inflation, and keep employment high. In the 1970s, the political pressure to keep employment high was insane. President Richard Nixon was obsessed with winning re-election in 1972. There are actual tapes, because with Nixon there are always tapes, of Nixon bullying Arthur Burns. He basically told him, "I don't care about inflation, I care about jobs. Keep the money flowing so the voters are happy." So Burns kept interest rates artificially low. He kept the money printer whirring. When inflation started to tick up in the early 70s, Burns made a fatal error in judgment. He looked at the rising prices of oil and food and said, "Well, those are volatile. Those are just temporary shocks. If we strip those out, inflation isn't that bad." This is the birth of core inflation, the idea that you should measure inflation by ignoring the things people actually need to survive, like food and energy. Burns thought the inflation was cost push, caused by unions and Arabs, and not monetary, caused by the Fed. He thought he couldn't fix it with interest rates, so he let the money supply grow and grow and grow. By the time the Fed realized their mistake, the genie was out of the bottle. Inflation hit 12.3% in 1974. Burns would try to hike rates a little bit, the economy would slow down, politicians would scream, and he would cut rates again. This is called stop-go policy. It is the worst possible way to manage a central bank. It's like slamming on the brakes and then flooring the gas pedal repeatedly. You don't get anywhere, and you destroy the engine. Fast forward to the 2020s. Does stop-go sound familiar? Does it's just transitory sound familiar? In 2021, Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve looked at the spiking CPI numbers and told us famously that inflation was transitory. They said it was just supply chains. They said it would pass. They kept interest rates at near zero, while the government pumped trillions of dollars of stimulus into the economy. It was the Arthur Burns playbook, remastered in high definition. Just like in the 70s, the central bank underestimated the stickiness of inflation. They waited too long to act. And when they finally did start raising rates in 2022, they had to do it at a historic pace, risking a massive recession. The parallel is terrifying. We have a central bank that was politically pressured, this time by the need to monetize massive government deficits, to keep rates low for too long. They focused on maximum employment and ignored the stability of the currency. The result in the 70s was a decade of lost growth. The result today? We are still finding out, but if history rhymes, your 401k is in for a bumpy ride. 4. Guns, butter, and the death of gold. If Arthur Burns was the getaway driver, the US federal government was the bank robber. To understand why the 1970s economy collapsed, we have to rewind slightly to the late 1960s. President Lyndon B. Johnson had a grand vision. He wanted to build a great society, massive welfare programs, war on poverty, infrastructure, the works. At the same time, the United States was getting bogged down in the Vietnam War. Economists call this guns and butter. Usually a country has to choose, do you want a powerful military, guns, or a luxurious domestic life, butter? LBJ said, I'll take both, please. The government spent money like a drunken sailor. Actually, that's an insult to sailors. At least sailors spend their own money. The US government was spending money it didn't have. This spending spree created a massive pile of dollars floating around the world. Foreign nations, particularly France, looked at this mountain of paper money and said, you know what? We don't want these dollars anymore. We want the gold you promised to exchange them for. By 1971, the US gold reserves were bleeding out. President Nixon had a choice: cut spending, political suicide, or change the rules of the game. On August 15, 1971, Nixon went on TV and temporarily suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold. This is known as the Nixon Shock. Temporary. That was 50 years ago. By severing the link between the dollar and gold, the government removed the only discipline they had. There was no longer a physical limit on how much money they could print to fund their deficits. The result in the 70s was a decade of unchecked deficit spending that fueled the inflation fire. The modern parallel. If you think the spending in the 60s and 70s was bad, look at a chart of US federal debt today. In the 1970s, a $50 billion deficit was considered a national emergency. Today, we borrow $1 trillion every 100 days. We are currently running a guns and butter strategy on steroids. Guns. We are funding proxy wars in Ukraine and Israel, plus a massive defense budget to counter China. Butter. We have Social Security and Medicare specifically for an aging boomer population that is retiring en masse, plus the lingering costs of the COVID stimulus and the Inflation Reduction Act. We are running wartime deficits during peacetime. In the 70s, the debt to GDP ratio was around 30%. Today, it is 120%. The fiscal situation today is mathematically worse than the 1970s. Back then, the government had room to borrow. Today, the credit card is maxed out. But we keep asking for credit limit increases. When the government pumps this much liquidity into the system, that money chases goods and services, bidding up prices. It is the fiscal equivalent of pouring jet fuel on a barbecue. 5. the death of equities, the lost decade for investors. There is a myth that stocks are a perfect hedge against inflation. Just buy the S&P 500, they say. It always goes up. Let me introduce you to the stagflation bear market. From 1966 to 1982, the Dow Jones Industrial Average essentially went nowhere. In 1966, the Dow touched 1,000. In 1982, it was about 1,000. 16 years, zero growth. But wait, it gets worse. That is just the nominal price. If you adjust for inflation, the stock market lost nearly 70% of its purchasing power during that period. On August 13, 1979, Businessweek published one of the most famous magazine covers in financial history, The Death of Equities. The article argued that buying stocks was a fool's game. Why risk your money in the stock market for a 4% dividend when you could put your money in a boring government bond and get a guaranteed 15% yield? This is the trap of stagflation. High interest rates crush stock valuations because bonds become more attractive. High inflation eats away at corporate profits. Input costs soar. Low growth means companies can't expand. Imagine you're an investor in 1974. The S&P 500 crashes 48%. You look at your portfolio and realize half your wealth is gone. You panic sell, you move to cash. But then inflation runs at 12%, so your cash is melting like an ice cube in the sun. There was nowhere to hide except, ironically, gold and real estate, commodities. The modern parallel. Look at the stock market today. We have valuations that rival the 1999 dot-com bubble. The Shiller PE ratio, a measure of how expensive stocks are, is historically sky high. Investors today have been trained like Pavlov's dogs to buy the dip because for the last 15 years, the Fed always saved the day. But in a stagflationary environment, the Fed cannot save the stock market. If they print money to boost stocks, inflation goes up. If they fight inflation, stocks go down. We are seeing the early signs of a lost decade. If inflation remains sticky at 4-5% and rates stay high, the math for the S&P 500 breaks. We could easily see a scenario where the stock market churns sideways for 10 years, frustrating everyone. You might see the Dow hit 40,000, then 30,000, then 40,000 again. You'll feel like you're making money on the upswings, but when you go to buy a house or pay for college, you'll realize your gains were just an illusion of currency devaluation. 6. The crisis of confidence. The Recession. Economics isn't just about charts, it's about feelings. And the 1970s felt bad. It wasn't just the gas lines, it was the feeling that the country was falling apart. You had the Watergate scandal, which destroyed trust in the presidency. You had the failure in Vietnam. You had serial killers like Ted Bundy and the son of Sam dominating the news. Cities like New York were literally burning down, bankrupt and crime-ridden. Then came Jimmy Carter. On July 15, 1979, President Carter gave what became known as the Malaise speech, though he never used the word malaise. He sat on TV and told the American people that the country was suffering from a crisis of confidence. He scolded the public for being too consumerist. He said, "Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but by what one owns." He wasn't wrong, philosophically, but politically, it was a disaster. Americans didn't want to be told to put on a sweater and lower their expectations. They wanted a solution. They felt like the leaders had lost control of the ship. This creates a psychological environment where people stop investing in the future. Business owners don't build new factories because they don't trust the government to manage the currency. Consumers stop saving and start doom spending because they think the money will be worthless later. The modern parallel. We are living in the ultimate malaise right now. Look at the polls. Trust in Congress, the media, the Supreme Court and the banks is at historic lows. We have a phenomenon economists are calling the Recession. The GDP numbers say the economy is growing, but the average person feels like they are broke. Why? Because the things that matter, housing, food, childcare, are unaffordable. We see the same social fracturing. Just like the radical groups of the 70s, we have extreme polarization today. We have a sense that the system is rigged. When people believe the game is rigged, they stop playing by the rules. We see this in the rise of retail theft, the breakdown of social norms, and the embrace of fringe political movements. The 1970s proved that stagflation destroys the social fabric. It makes neighbours turn on neighbours. It makes citizens turn on their government. And we are walking right back into that volatile mix of anger and hopelessness. 7. The Volcker Shock. The the painful cure. So how does this horror movie end? In the 1970s, it didn't end with a whimper, it ended with a sledgehammer. Enter Paul Volcker. Volcker became Fed chair in 1979. He stood 6'11", smoked cheap cigars, and essentially didn't care if you liked him. He understood one thing. To kill inflation, you have to kill demand. You have to make money so expensive that nobody can afford to borrow it. On October 6, 1979, known as the Saturday Night Special, Volcker held a secret emergency meeting and announced a radical change. He was going to stop targeting interest rates and start targeting the money supply itself. He jacked interest rates to the moon. By 1981, the federal funds rate hit 20%. Imagine that today. Imagine your mortgage rate is 18%. Imagine your car loan is 22%. Imagine your credit card is... Well, credit cards are always a rip-off, but imagine they were 40%. The result was brutal. The economy crashed into a deep double-dip recession. Unemployment spiked to nearly 11%. Farmers drove their tractors to Washington, D.C. and blockaded the Federal Reserve building in protest. Construction workers mailed 2x4s of lumber to Volcker's office, with angry messages written on them because nobody was building houses. But it worked. By 1983, inflation collapsed from 14% to 3%. The fever broke. The Great Moderation began, and the US economy entered a massive boom period in the 80s and 90s. The modern parallel and the trap. Here is the terrifying part. We know how to fix inflation. You pull a Volcker. You raise rates until the economy screams. But can we? In 1980, the US national debt was about $900 billion. Today, it is $34 trillion. If the Federal Reserve raised interest rates to 20% today, the interest payments on the national debt alone would consume the entire federal budget. The US government would essentially default. The banking system holding trillions in bonds would implode. We saw a preview of this with Silicon Valley Bank. We are in a trap that Volcker didn't have to deal with. It is called fiscal dominance. The debt is so high that the Fed cannot raise rates high enough to truly kill inflation without bankrupting the government. So instead of a sharp, painful Volcker shock, we might just get a long, slow bleed. A decade where inflation stays at 4 to 5%, eating your savings, while the government hopes to inflate away the debt. Final thoughts. So, are the 1970s back? Let's look at the checklist. 1. Supply shocks. Check. War and trade fragmentation. 2. Wage price spiral. Loading. Strikes and labour shortages. 3. Incompetent monetary policy. Check. Transitory. 4. Massive deficit spending. Double check. 5. Geopolitical instability. Check. The parallels are not just there, they are screaming at us. We are sleepwalking into a period of stagflation that could define the next decade of your life. The era of easy money, of 0% interest rates, cheap goods from China, and stocks that only go up, is over. The 1970s weren't just about bad fashion and disco. They were a painful lesson in what happens when a country lives beyond its means for too long. The bill always comes due, and right now the waiter is walking toward our table. But here is the good news. The world didn't end in 1979. People who adapted, who invested in real assets, who learned new skills, and who understood the game. They didn't just survive, they built massive wealth in the recovery that followed. Stagflation is a transfer of wealth. It transfers wealth from the unprepared to the prepared, from the savers of cash to the owners of assets. If you want to be on the right side of that transfer, you need to understand exactly where to put your money when the dollar is dying. And luckily for you, that is exactly what I will cover in our upcoming video. Keep an eye for it. Thanks for watching.